the late Lord Ashdown, Helen Clark, the former President of New Zealand, Bob Geldof, Lord Heseltine, Lord Haig, and last year, in a change of métier, the award-winning architect Thomas Heatherwick. I'm very sorry that Guy and Junior aren't able to join us this evening, but it is my enormous pleasure to introduce for this year's Mansfield lecture not only a political big beast, which was my instruction when I came. This is what you have to get for the Hands Lecture, a political big beast, but also one of our own, Chris Bryant, who's come to give this year's lecture. And Chris is one of our own because he read English at Mansfield before going on to read theology and being ordained into the Church of England in 1986. And he then spent 2.5 years as a curate and then as a chaplain, a youth chaplain. And having joined the Labour Party in 1986, he became the MP for Rhondda in June 2001. And he's served on a variety of important roles in Parliament, including on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, on the Joint Committee of the Lords and Commons on reform of the House of Lords, and he was the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe from November 2002 until May 2007. So as well as a number of these roles, and then latterly Deputy Leader of the House of Commons, he has been the Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, but he resigned from the Shadow Cabinet in June 2016 and is now
We've got more years to go yet.
Yeah, he's now the chair of the Parliamentary Standards Committee, which is the context in which we invited him here to talk about something rotten in the state. His talk is sadly much more topical than we would like it to be. We are live streaming it as well as holding it live, and after the talk we'll be able to have people in the room will be able to ask some questions. I'm very delighted to welcome you here tonight, Chris. Thank you.
I know I'm wearing a waistcoat, but I don't think that makes me a big beast. I'm not hiding that I've grown in stature in any way. It's always very odd hearing your whole life history sort of read out, especially when you've had like very significant figures do this lecture before. So it's a great honour for me to be here. There's just one thing I'd add to my career, which is that I was a Remainer, I remain a Remainer, and I will remain a Remainer until my dying day. Rather weirdly, it says here, Friday the 11th of March 2022, and I've only just realised that today is the 19th anniversary of the day when I was in the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and we were doing an inquiry into privacy and media intrusion, and we had Rebecca Brooks and, well, Rebecca Wade as she was then, and Andy Coulson before us, who were the editor of The Sun and the News of the World, and I asked them, have you ever paid a police officer for information? And they said yes. And Andy Coulson then said, but that was only within the law. And I pointed out that it wasn't within the law, and of course, subsequently so did a court. And I only remember that because the 11th of March is my father's birthday, so it's a delight to be here with you today. It's easy. I'm going to talk about corruption, and I'm going to talk about Russia, and there's a connection. That's basically the speech. Actually, I can finish now. It's easy to think that corruption is an absolute wrong. We know it when we see it or when we catch a whiff of it. But the line from Hamlet applies perfectly to the concept of corruption through the ages. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. If you'd asked a Tudor or a Stuart poet, theologian, or moral philosopher what constituted corruption, they would have said that it included sexual immorality, licentiousness, fornication, adultery, or any other form of sinfulness that demonstrated humanity's fallen, corrupted state. Indeed, the phrase, the canker or cancer of corruption, first appeared in English in a religious text of 1590. And many early English concepts of corruption derived from an abhorrence of the Roman Catholic Church, with its supposed theological delinquency, its extortion of money from the faithful, its superstitions, and its abuse of power. Corruption and rottenness were thought to be indivisible. Perceptions changed, though. Witness how we today see the concept of making money from interest on loans. Such usury was once universally condemned by good Christian folk as corrupt, but at least since 1624 it has become an intrinsic and state-sanctioned part of the financial and economic system. We condemn excessive interest rates, sometimes anyway, especially when levied on the poorest in society, but the concept of charging interest itself is accepted. The same is true of the concept of self-interest. Adam Smith praised it as the engine of economic advance, but others thought it was the root of all corruption. Luxury, too, was thought to corrupt. Luxury has been the bane of every nation, wrote the Reverend Adam Sibbett in 1800. It led to debility and corruption, he said. And the early Christians had something to say about it too. The love of money is the root of all evil, wrote the apostle in the first letter to Timothy, adding, while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. You could argue that that's what we're suffering now, having been in love with Russian money for too long. Some financial misdemeanours did count as corruption in the Stuart era. When Sir Giles Mompesson, great name, the MP for Great Bedwin, was found guilty in 1621 of abusing the monopolies he had been granted by the Crown, including the licensing of inns and the sale of gold thread, he was disgraced and forced to walk down the Strand, this is a quotation, with his face in a horse's anus. I think that means that he was sitting backwards on the horse. But we might bring this back. But the very concept of monopolies, which granted exclusive rights to produce and sell a wide range of products, including playing cards, wine, sherry, candles, and so on, was not questioned for many centuries. And he, Sir Giles Mompesson, was quietly allowed to retire. The East India Company, indeed, it had a monopoly for many centuries, and that only ended in 1833. Despite many accusations of corruption, which led to major impeachment trials. Likewise, Samuel Pepys, or Pepys, I think we're meant to say, condemned corruption in others, but happily showed off the silver flagons and the very pretty mare that he had received as bribes. His patron, when he was working for the Royal Navy as an administrator, his patron, Lord Sandwich, indeed told him that it was not the salary of any place that did make a man rich, but the opportunity of getting money while he is in the place. Pepys claimed that he never sought reward for favours, but he was happy to receive gifts freely given and seemed to think that as long as he took gifts from absolutely everyone, he couldn't be showing any kind of favouritism. This was also an argument advanced by Francis Bacon just before he was thrown out of office. Actually, slightly unfairly, but anyway, that's another matter. Since ministerial or military office did not bring a salary until well into the late 19th century, it was expected that those in high office would farm their clients. That was, in essence, how you made your living. Moreover, there was no prohibition on selling an office, including parliamentary seats, to the highest bidder. The only stricture was that one should not levy excessive charges. Anything less than excessive was fine and dandy. So, in the words of Philippians, let your moderation be made known unto all men. Thus, Thomas Parker, the first Earl of Macclesfield, who was Lord Chief Justice and then Lord Chancellor, so should have known better, at the start of the 18th century, argued when he was impeached for corruption in 1725, he'd taken the best part of £100,000, which today would be roughly £11 million, that taking a present or taking money from persons upon their recommendations or nominations into offices, though they do concern the administration or execution of justice, is not a crime in its own nature. It is no act of immorality. It is no act of injustice to any man. The Lords found him guilty of high crimes and misdemeanours nonetheless, yet he was allowed to retire with much of his ill-gotten wealth, and the sale of offices was not finally outlawed until 1809, and military commissions were still being sold up until 1871. None of that counted as corruption. Much of the reform movement in the early 19th century and throughout the 19th century was, of course, devoted to uprooting this so-called old corruption. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, 1868 and 1884 abolished pocket boroughs, introduced secret ballots and struck down many corrupt practices, and inspired modern politicians to believe that corruption was indeed dead in the United Kingdom. Britain was clean. Banana republics were foreign to these shores. We had even introduced limits on campaign expenditure. And Transparency Index puts Britain today 11th out of all the world's countries on corruption. Now, I would argue that the concept of corruption has changed, of course, but I want to make a few comments on problems in the British state today, because while I don't think the country is as corrupt as some other countries, we are in danger of sliding into the grease. I want to start with the abrogation of power, which is not normally included in a concept of corruption, but I think is at the very heart of it. The central concept of the British political system is winner takes it all. As long as the Prime Minister enjoys the confidence of the House of Commons, as long as they have a majority, they have total command. They alone appoint or dismiss ministers, dole out honours and seats in the House of Lords, determine if and when Parliament sits, when it goes into recess or is prorogued, and what legislation it considers, set the dates of a general election, establish the machinery of government, and determine all taxation and expenditure. A Prime Minister can use their majority to alter or suspend the standing orders of the House of Commons at will. Only a government minister can table an amendment to vary a duty or a tax. Only a minister can table the date for a parliamentary recess. Only a government bill gets precedence on the order paper. Only government amendments are guaranteed to be considered. And it's worth bearing in mind that the British Prime Minister is able to appoint more ministers than France, Germany and Italy all put together. Or, for that matter, if you don't like the European comparison, more than India, Australia and New Zealand put together. And that maintains a phenomenal grip in the House of Commons. 95 members out of the 650 can be ministers. And when you add on top of that trade envoys, who are given preferential treatment for travelling around the world on behalf of the United Kingdom, plus PPSs, which are parliamentary private secretaries who are MPs, bag carriers, in larger numbers than was ever conceived of when they were first introduced in the First World War, or other minor appointments, all of which come with expense accounts, you can see that the Prime Minister has a phenomenal grip over the House of Commons. As Brexit and COVID showed, government now regularly gives itself phenomenal additional powers thanks to clauses in primary legislation that allow ministers to introduce regulations, that is to say secondary legislation, normally in the form of statutory instruments. Nobody really cares about this, but I do. Many use the negative procedure, which means that they come into force unless the House of Commons or the House of Lords objects within a set period, even though the opportunity to object has to be granted by the government itself. In the 2019-2021 session of Parliament, the government drew on 131 Acts of Parliament for these secondary powers. 13% of all statutory instruments came into force before they were even published. Came into force even before they were published. In some cases, rules, for instance mandating the use of face masks, were in place for a whole month before they were even laid before Parliament. The latest set of sanctions regulations, which hang off the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act of 2018, came into force the moment they were published, before they were ever debated. Some were introduced using the affirmative process, but extraordinarily, if every single member of the committee considering a motion on a statutory instrument were to vote no, it would still be carried into law, because the motion is that this House has considered the matter of this statutory instrument. So by definition, even if you voted no, you have shown that you have considered the matter. As for expenditure, a key aspect of government, of course, we in the United Kingdom don't have a budget at all. Not in the proper sense of the word, not in the sense that most other legislatures would understand, or for that matter a local authority or a governing body of a council would understand. That is to say, with income and expenditure laid beside one another and open to amendment and debate. We have a budget statement, which we call the budget, in which the government announces what it intends to do in a finance bill. If we, as a backbencher or an opposition MP, think the increase in the state pension, for instance, is too low, all we can do is make a speech complaining about it. We can't table a higher increase. If we vote against the government's increase, we're voting against any increase at all. So the government has us over a barrel. This, I would argue, opens the government up to terrible new areas of corruption. The Shared Prosperity Fund and Levelling Up Fund, which have been recently introduced, rely on MPs lobbying ministers for good causes in their patch. They're a competition between different areas and have to be endorsed by the local MP. This is not in itself corrupt, but it is corrupting. It requires MPs to lobby ministers and ministers to do MPs favours on behalf of their constituents. If a minister wants, for instance, to become the leader of their political party, they might choose who they're going to help on the basis of how they're going to vote in a future leadership contest. We've already heard of members of Parliament complaining that whips and ministers have threatened to deny a constituency funds if their MP were to vote the wrong way on a key issue. And in one case, we had one minister approving funds from the Towns Fund to another minister's constituency, and then the other minister awarding funds to the other minister and vice versa. In America, they call this pork barrel politics. In the UK, I think we should be now calling it corruption. It corrupts the government and the Member of Parliament and the minister. Ministers say that nobody has ever proved that there was anything corrupt about the awarding of PPE contracts during COVID. Yet they admit that there was a VIP lane which was only advertised to Conservative members of Parliament and members of the Lords. And companies who bid via this lane were 10 times more likely to win a contract than others who didn't have access via a Conservative MP or a peer. The High Court ruled in January of this year that this was illegal. In the old days, this would have been called an abuse of discretion, in that those in office abuse their discrete power to make decisions, whether in the awarding of contracts, the appointment of people to public bodies, the granting of planning permission, or the development of legislation that benefits or harms individuals that are close to the person making the decision. This also applies to government appointments to national bodies. For a long time, nepotism, appointing your family members to lucrative posts, was considered common sense in the United Kingdom. It was partly why you bothered to get into politics in the first place. When Viscount Melbourne, for instance, was Home Secretary and his deputy died, the then Prime Minister Earl Grey immediately recommended to Melbourne that his own son, Viscount Howick, take the post. Melbourne's only objection was that he might be too squeamish about the use of the death penalty. But favouritism is alive and well in United Kingdom politics today. David Cameron seemed to ennoble virtually everyone who ever worked for him, and Boris Johnson has gone one step further, putting his younger brother in the House of Lords. That's why I believe we need serious reform of the second chamber, which should be based on an elected principle. More mundane, however, is the appointment of friends to arts organisations like the National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery, and the BBC. This is not about money, but it is certainly about prestige and ideology. The government failed to get their preferred candidate, Paul Dacre, former editor-in-chief of the Mail, in charge of Ofcom, largely because he knew pretty much nothing about broadcasting or any other media. But it has become commonplace for ministers to insist on a new list of potential appointees to be brought to them before they make the final decision, which should only include Conservatives. The only criteria for appointment now seems to be support for the Prime Minister and opposition to the so-called woke agenda. I hate that concept, but anyway. Incidentally, I know Moscow Patriarch Kirill would agree with such a strategy. He declared the other day that the invasion of Ukraine was part of a struggle against sin and pressure from liberal foreigners to hold gay parades at the price of admission to their ranks. He was at the time wearing a $19,000 watch. Obviously, the oath of poverty had not remained with him. He certainly knows the meaning of corruption, and I knew somebody would eventually blame it all on the gays. But favouritism is an abuse. And I would say this, if this were a Labour government doing this, the arts should be free of political interference. Part of the problem in the UK, I believe, is the absence of checks and balances. As I noted earlier, there is no ultimate check on the power of the Prime Minister. In theory, we have a strict ministerial code, but the only arbiter of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister. His supposedly independent advisor, Lord Geit, has no power even to initiate an investigation. And his predecessor resigned when the Prime Minister refused even to publish his investigation into allegations of bullying by the Home Secretary. It's been sort of entertaining to hear lots of people praising the independent inquiry into bullying by the former Speaker of the House of Commons and by people who were absolutely adamant that there should not be a report on bullying by the Home Secretary. One other potential check to the Prime Minister and to government is the Electoral Commission. It fined the Conservative Party recently for failing to declare a donation from Lord Brownlow for the redecoration of Downing Street. Now the government is seeking to replace... now the government is seeking to place the Electoral Commission's strategy in ministers' hands. A power grab which the Commission itself has condemned as without precedent in Western democracies. That's not the only meddling in democracy that's going on. More than 2 million people fail to register to vote in the United Kingdom. Most of them are poorer, younger, and from ethnic minorities, groups that are more likely to vote Labour than Conservative. Rather than encourage people to register, the government is now making it more difficult to vote, insisting on photo ID at the ballot box. This has a double benefit for the Conservative Party. Uniquely in the West, we draw constituency boundaries on the basis of registered voters rather than population. So seats are being redistributed at the next general election from urban areas to rural areas, from Labour to Conservative. And since more poor people do not drive or travel overseas, many have no photo ID. All in all, it makes it more difficult for Labour voters to vote, and therefore obviously more difficult for Labour to win. This is the same strategy of voter suppression as Donald Trump and his allies have used very successfully in the United States of America. Two further points. One aspect of a corrupt society is that those in power engage in bullying and sexual harassment. I have seen it a lot, I have to say, in my 21 years in Parliament. MPs shouting at staff, humiliating them, throwing things at them, standing over them, standing too close to them, touching them up. And it's particularly dangerous in a place which fundamentally works on the basis of power and patronage. I feel Parliament is genuinely getting better on this score. The introduction of the independent expert panel and the independent complaints and grievance scheme have been really important. And they are, I think, giving victims a chance to get a fair hearing, get rectification and justice. And I think it's also changing the culture in the House of Commons. And whatever you think about John Bercow as a reforming speaker, or about any of the decisions he made in the chair, there is something very, very powerful about an independent process deciding, as the independent expert panel did this week, that nobody in Parliament is above the law. That is not to say that the rules seem to apply equally to everyone. I will just say this. They don't, because last week a young student from the Rhondda who is studying in Bristol was fined £2,050 for attending a party during lockdown. There's another point. As things stand, the rules mean that if two members of Parliament are taken to a football match together and are wined and dined by a commercial client, the backbench or opposition MP will have to declare that hospitality within 28 days if it costs more than £300 and will have to provide full details of the cost and of the host. But if a government minister claims that they only attended in a ministerial capacity, they only have to publish that they did so without any details whatsoever up to 9 months later. In other words, backbench and opposition MPs are subject to stricter rules than government ministers. I want to change that, and I think my committee will do so. On conflicts of interest, one of the most extraordinary things about the Owen Paterson case was that several people seemed to have no understanding whatsoever of what constituted paid advocacy, which has been banned in Parliament in some shape or form for several centuries. Rory Stewart, a man I like and admire, who was a minister who was approached corruptly by Owen Paterson, claimed that the meetings he held with him must have been acceptable because his civil servants would have told him if they weren't. This places extraordinary reliance on civil servants. But it was not civil servants' job to understand the rules of the House of Commons or to spot the conflict of interest. It was Rory Stewart's job to do that. Yet the most extraordinary moment, I think, in my time in Parliament came when the whole of the government decided to throw everything at saving Owen Paterson. They tabled a motion to suspend and alter the rules of the House at the 11th hour in a disciplinary process for a named individual, Owen Paterson. That's not what you should have in a proper democratic system. That's what you might expect in a banana republic, or for that matter, in Putin's Russia. That in itself, I believe, was a terrible conflict of interest, and I'm still amazed so many MPs voted for the motion, though lots of them pretend to me that they didn't. I have a copy of the list. Lying. Contrary to popular mythology, lying is actually not normally a wise strategy in politics. Most of us feel terrible shame, and if we get caught telling a fib or a lie, we are absolutely mortified. Stafford Cripps, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the post-war Labour government, never forgave himself for lying to the public about his intention to devalue the pound, even though he obviously had to lie about it, because otherwise the policy itself would have been undermined. But the shameless, the cynical, and the morally bankrupt always double down on the lie. It is well known that the rules of the House of Commons mean that no member can accuse another member of being dishonourable. It's one of the reasons that members of Parliament are not meant to shake hands, because shaking hands is meant to be a demonstration that you're accepting that the other person is honourable. That means that you cannot call another MP a traitor or a liar unless it is on an explicit motion to that effect. The member who wants to make such an accusation, even when the evidence is incontrovertible, or for that matter, if for instance, the National Statistics Organisation has written to the Minister to say that it's a lie, the member who wants to make such an allegation will be enforced by the chair to add the word inadvertent, or else that member will be thrown out of the chamber. In other words, the inveterate and deliberate liar gets off, and the accuser is forced to tell a lie or be sanctioned. I don't think that rule can last. Let me turn to Russia, a subject I've been interested in for a very long time. Russia has provided the UK with a particular challenge over the last 15 years, and ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in particular the private appropriation of much monopolised wealth, especially from gas, oil and other extractive industries in the Russian Federation and other allied countries. There are several reasons it's been a particular challenge for us. British strengths, I believe, have become British weaknesses. We have a vibrant and imaginative banking sector. Imaginative is important in that. Our accountancy firms can be even more creative. We have a strong court system which makes it possible to enforce contracts. We welcome entrepreneurs. We welcome people regardless of their nationality or ethnicity. We have long artistic, cultural and economic links with Russia. We have good schools and universities. We have rows upon rows of luxury shops. We speak English, which has replaced French as a common second language in most of Russia. We have a housing market that continues to appreciate. which makes it easy to launder significant amounts of cash. We are keen on very wealthy people basing themselves in the UK, and we have a protective attitude towards financial privacy, which means that we still don't have a full register of the ownership of land in the United Kingdom, nor a public register of the ownership of property by overseas entities, though we might start putting that in place by next Tuesday. Nor does Companies House have any power to question, interrogate or verify any information provided to it. In fact, if you look up a director of a company on Companies House website, you will notice a little line which says we are not able to guarantee that this information is true. This has led to a concatenation of political decisions that have left us, I believe, uniquely vulnerable to Russian corruption. The first mistake was the introduction of Tier 1 investor visas in 1994 and their extension thereafter for those with £2 million or more to invest. If you had £10 million to invest, you just had to wait 2 years to get indefinite leave to remain in the UK. Many thousands applied, and many ended up with dual nationality. Very few questions were asked about the source of the wealth, how the money was to be invested, or whether, indeed, it ever was invested. We now know that 6,312, about half of those visas, have had to be reviewed due to national security concerns. It has meant we have allowed thousands to come and live in the UK with remarkably few questions asked about where that money has come from, or whether it has actually been invested. This has left us particularly vulnerable to wealthy figures from China and Russia. In the words of the Intelligence and Security Committee at the House of Commons, which their report in 2019, published in 2020, the Tier 1 visa scheme was counterproductive in that it offered ideal mechanisms by which illicit finance could be recycled through what has been referred to as the London laundromat. This in turn led to a significant new industry of enablers: lawyers, consigliere, accountants, concierge services, estate agents, PR agencies, and I'm told escort agencies, who made a killing out of servicing wealthy Russian clients. On top of that, Russians who have been granted British, and therefore dual nationality, have been encouraged to give money to the Conservative Party in large amounts. Thus, Lyubov Chernyukin, the wife of Putin's former finance minister, who was granted dual nationality by the Conservative government in 2012, has become the biggest female political donor in British history, giving more than £2.1 million, including £80,000 very recently. The problem is that just as you cannot make significant amounts of money in China without being an active member of the Communist Party with all the requirements that that brings with it, nor can you make or keep serious money in Russia without the imprimatur of President Putin. The day you start a business in Russia, you have to bribe someone for your job or for a license, and already you are in hock. The moment you get into trouble, fail to pay a tax bill, refuse to pay the bribe you paid last week, or cross a Putin ally, you find yourself having to do Putin an even bigger favour, because political favours in that particular cul-de-sac are always two-way traffic. Otherwise, as Mikhail Khodorkovsky found out, you end up in a Siberian jail, in his case twice. Or, as Boris Nemtsov found, you're murdered in broad daylight in Moscow. Or, as Alexei Navalny discovered, you're arrested, poisoned, and imprisoned for having been poisoned. It is true that Putin has tried to extradite some oligarchs from the UK. Our courts have repeatedly refused those requests on the grounds that they were entirely political. And Russia never extradites a Russian national. Witness one member of the Duma, Alexei Lugovoy, who was one of the two people who murdered Alexander Litvinenko in the UK. Some rare exceptions have held out against Putin and survived, but the list of Putin oligarchs who have significant assets in the UK and have laundered either their money or their reputation by buying football clubs, newspapers or galleries, funding colleges, universities, museums and other philanthropic ventures is a very lengthy one. One might have expected them to be rushing into print or into television studios to denounce Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, but their silence has been deafening, as has been the silence of many of the people that they have wined, dined and invited to their palazzos, their villas and their yachts, and the enablers who earn their living off them. And this takes me to the yet more insidious aspect of the steady corruption of the United Kingdom that has gone on over the last few years. In 2019, the Intelligence and Security Committee produced a report on Russia. It concluded that the United Kingdom was one of Russia's top Western intelligence targets. It noted significant malicious state-sponsored cyber activity involving organised criminal groups aimed at the UK. It pointed to significant misinformation campaigns and the targeting of UK politicians. It also intimated that there had been serious attempts by the Russian state to undermine and influence the British democratic system. The Prime Minister delayed the publication of this report until after the 2019 general election. When it was published in 2020, there were lengthy and substantive redactions which rendered part of the report completely incomprehensible. What the government very pointedly refused to do, unlike the US government, was investigate illicit Russian attempts at interference in our electoral system. I think the Prime Minister did so because he feared that people would conclude that Russia had sought to influence the EU referendum in favour of Brexit. Interestingly, when asked whether he had ever seen evidence of any such interference, both he and Theresa May stated that they had not seen any successful attempts at interference. They didn't define what successful meant. This, despite the fact that Theresa May made a very pointed speech on the 14th of November 2017 telling Russia that we know what you are doing. Since one of Putin's strategic aims has long been the dismantling of the European Union and sowing disunity in the West, I think we know what that means. Whether Russia played a definitive role in the EU vote is open to conjecture. But the fact that the UK refused even to ask the question, I think, is genuinely troubling. And for Putin, Brexit was undoubtedly a consummation devoutly to be wished. I end with just a few short suggestions about things that we could do to improve things in the UK. Obviously, I would start with we could change the government, but I'm not meaning to be partisan today. First, a new statutory offence should be introduced in the UK of misconduct in public office. At the moment, it's just a common law offence, very difficult to prosecute, very difficult to comprehend. The police don't know what to do with it. We should have a proper statutory offence. Secondly, the independent advisor on ministerial interests should be given statutory powers and the right to initiate investigations and come to his or her own conclusions. Thirdly, the parliamentary rule on accusing another MP of lying in Parliament should be amended. I don't want us to descend into endless name-calling, but I think we have to get to a more sensible position. Fourthly, ministers should be subject to the same declaration and transparency rules as all other MPs. After all, I want to know soon after a meeting or a dinner or an expensive reception or a trip abroad whether a minister has been speaking to Rupert Murdoch or whoever else. And finally, we must wean ourselves off the addiction to Russian or any other kind of bling. It has blinded us for far too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for a fascinating talk. And if you people who are standing, if you do want to come, there are a few seats at the front. I'm sure no one will mind if you come and take them. I wonder why you think, why is it, do you think, that public life has become more corrupt in recent years?
I think we've become terribly complacent. We've sort of assumed that we're the best nation in the world, and our patriotism, I think, has sometimes misled us. A better patriotism is one that always exposes everything to better consideration. I mean, I take, everybody always, the thing that really winds me up in the House of Commons, it happened twice yesterday, is when somebody says, here in the mother of parliaments, and I want to say, right, so we, for a start, you're quoting John Bright, who was actually criticising England as, who had mothered parliaments, because we still didn't have proper democracy, we didn't have the universal suffrage. He was saying that in the middle of the 19th century. Secondly, I think you think that we are the oldest democracy in the world. We're not. Iceland's Alþingi is older. Even the Isle of Man has a longer history of representation. So I think sometimes we have just become too proud, and pride comes before a fall.
Do you think it's because we have a very, very strong executive, and so what Peter Sir Hennessy calls the good chaps theory really matters, and when people stop having a sort of inner set of values about what you do in that role, like appointing your friends or having fast lanes, the thing falls apart?
Well, if you take the prorogation issue, the length of a parliamentary session is determined by prorogation. It's entirely up to the Prime Minister to go to the Queen and ask for a prorogation of Parliament, and so as to start a new session of Parliament. Normally, the length of that is 4, 5, 6 days. You will recall that Boris Johnson went to the Queen and argued for a longer one, basically so as to get round some corners on Brexit. And the court decided that he had done so illegally. That whole concept of prorogation is based on the good chaps theory, and I apologise for the word chaps, but that's where it came from. And if the chaps aren't good, it doesn't work. And I think if you were to go back to the 1930s, if Edward VIII had remained in office, would Chamberlain ever have fallen? Maybe not. So I think we have to have a stronger constitutional setup with more checks and balances, so that you can't just presume that everybody will be a good person. But on top of that, you can't have incentives for a good chap to become a bad chap, which is, I think, what we have today.
Okay. I know lots of people are going to have questions, so I'm going to restrain myself. But women and chaps are allowed to ask questions, so go ahead, and there are some microphones, so if you want to ask a question, then please wait for the microphone so other people can hear, and also the people on the live stream. And I know there are going to be questions, so who's going to be the first one? I can see a hand here.
First of all, thank you for a fantastic history of corruption in this country. Do you have anything to say about the role of the media, whether it's positive or negative, in either highlighting corruption or hiding it?
Well, it can do both, can't it? I mean, I long argued that when Rupert Murdoch had 40% of the total newspaper share in the UK, that was corrupting. It was way too much power to be held by a single person, especially when, on top of that, he had the single biggest broadcaster by cash value. That was just too much power, and he could use the newspapers to protect the much bigger commercial interest in the broadcaster, and exercised phenomenal power over MPs, using fear or favour. And I enjoyed taking him to court and winning. And everybody told me I should spend the money I won. I do like lawyers. I should give it all to charity, but I thought, bugger that. So we got a new bathroom, which we call the Rupert Room, and we think of him every time we shower. No, I mean, but at the same time, I mean, I know it's been. So when I read out 2 weeks ago the stuff I had from about Roman Abramovich, and I'm sorry to everybody who's a Russian. I know it's Abramovich, unless it's a patronymic, but it just means people don't know who you're talking about. But when I read that out about Roman 2 weeks ago, and him being a person of interest to Her Majesty's government for illicit activity, which was a Home Office document from 2019, that was given to me by a Sun journalist. And sometimes I do work with journalists to try and get things out into the light, and parliamentary privilege can be a really important aspect to that. So there are always dangers of getting too close to journalists. So it's a complicated arrangement sometimes. Personally, I'm a passionate supporter of the licence fee. I believe that it means we have a competition for quality journalism in the UK.
Here, and then here.
Hi, thank you. What are your views on proportional representations as a remedy? And also, would you support a written constitution for the UK?
I'm completely in favour of a written constitution, and I'm not a big fan of referendums, but it's probably the one thing that you could have a referendum on is a written constitution. I support proportional representation. I do have, however, I don't think it's necessarily the answer to corruption, because if you look in Spain, a country I love, the Partido Popular got itself into a terrible mess, in large part because of the list system, because in the end, the only person who decides who all the MPs are is the leader of the political party, because they decide whether they get on the list or not. Whereas at least in the UK, we have a system of independence, and it's been fascinating. The last few months have been fascinating for me. I mean, it's almost felt half the time as if the front benches are a bit irrelevant. We had Margaret Hodge got us all together last week when the economic crime bill was coming through, and which the government was calling emergency legislation. It wasn't emergency legislation, it was just long overdue legislation. But Margaret got us together, and so it was Ian Duncan-Smith, Liam Byrne, Stephen Kinnock, myself, Andrew Mitchell, Kevin Hollinrake, Robert Jenrick. I mean, an interesting coalition of people from different perspectives, Leila Moran and Alison Thewlis from the SNP. And we put together amendments, all of which will now be on the bill by the end of Monday. And so that concept of an independent MP who really only is accountable to their own constituents, it does have a role. It does have a role.
Thank you. So if you could just hand, sorry, two to your right, I think. Yes. Oh, has it gone? Okay, sorry. No one's coming.
Hi. Oh, thank you for a very interesting talk. I wanted to go back to your final call on us to wean ourselves off our addiction to Russian bling, and ask whether you would go beyond that and act on the need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels from Russia and other authoritarian regimes. Ukrainian climate activists last week called on world governments to end not only imports on Russian oil and gas, but rapidly phase out all fossil fuels in the name of peace, in addition to all the other compelling reasons to do so, like human health, planetary health, a livable future, as the IPCC report called it. So I want to ask whether you will support the Green New Deal bill to work towards the UK becoming a greener and fairer and peace-supporting economy.
So yeah, first of all, we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels full stop, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine and the relationship with Russia. I remember meeting a woman called Gladys, I can't remember her surname, in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. And she came from the Carteret Islands. And her people, there used to be, I think, 13 Carteret Islands. Because of global warming, one of the islands had disappeared. They went down to 12, and then another one, they went down to 11, and then they went back up to 12 because one of them split in half by the sea, by the ocean. And they were all going to have to leave the Carteret Islands and go and live on the mainland in Bougainvillea. And and that's when I knew that this is for all of us. We don't have a choice about this.
Great. So you're saying all the right things, but are you going to join the cross-party alliance and support the Green New Deal bill to make it concrete?
I've not seen the bill, and I'm always, when somebody says, "Will you support a bill?" I always want to go, well, I haven't read it yet.
Got a copy here, and I'm free after.
I'm fine. I thought that might be the case. But in principle, so there's two principles here. One, there's that, and secondly, of course, Europe has to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. one of the most depressing things for me is I love Russian culture, musically, artistically, at so many different levels. So it's really painful that Putin has done this to his people over these years, because all of this money is stolen from the Russian people. All those monopolies. It's exactly the same as Sir Giles Mompesson in 1621. It's exactly the same level of corruption. And the worst of it is he's relied on being, to use a Russian word, a monogorod. A monogorod is a city that only has one industry. And they only have one industry, and that is extractive industries, whether it's aluminium or oil and gas. I was very critical of the Germans, and for that matter, our own government, for not stopping Nord Stream 2 much earlier, because it just seemed to me that was putting Europe further into hock to Russia, but also making Russia never diversify. And actually what you've seen over the last 15 years is a massive brain drain from Russia. It's one of the highest educated countries in the world, but lots of people, the moment they're educated, they get out. So out of all of that, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I look forward to speaking to you later.
Can I just ask on that, because obviously there are important environmental reasons to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, but it's unlikely that Germany and Italy especially are going to turn off the existing pipeline overnight, because somebody told me the other day they thought average household energy prices would be about £10,000 a year in Europe if they did. So that probably won't enter, Nord Stream 2 won't come online, probably won't enter new contracts because of the need for energy security apart from anything else. That may lead to more nuclear power, but also it's unlikely that the Russians are going to pivot and start selling more fuel to China. So I just wonder what you think about the kind of geopolitical consequences of Russia being an enormous source of fuel for Western Europe at the moment.
Well, I think we've got to have both a short-term and a medium-term and a short-term, medium-term and long-term set of issues here. First of all, we should be trying to do everything we can to stop putting money into Russia's coffers at the moment.
Yeah.
We're fortunate that we're entering the spring and the summer, and Ursula von der Leyen said the other day that Europe has enough stockpiled for next winter, without a single drop or therm more coming. I'm not sure whether that's true, but that's certainly what she said the other day, and that may explain why, oddly, the amount of gas bought in the last week by Europe has gone up from Russia, rather than particularly temperatures and so on. She also announced, I think today, that by 2027 they want to be in a position where they wouldn't have to take any Russian gas at all. Now that's a very tough ask, but as I understand it, Germany and Italy have signed up to this.
But if that does happen, does it create a much closer alliance between
Russia and China?
Yeah.
Well, China's going to have to make an awful lot of decisions fairly soon. I mean, quite often the row is between Russia and China, but they do it behind closed doors. And Russia and China have much more of a border than anybody else does, and they have contested territory. Xi seems to have changed his position in the last 72 hours a bit, in that he wants a peaceful outcome, which is more than he was saying 10 days ago. India is a bigger problem because India is much more beholden, well, and Pakistan, but they're both much more beholden to Russia than China is. And I think China's got to make a decision. China's done remarkably well out of the rules-based order around the world since the Second World War, and it's got to make some decisions about whether it wants that enforceable or it wants to surrender it. And it's felt as if it wants to surrender it because it likes being an authoritarian regime, pretty much the same as Russia. But it gets more sensitive much more quickly. And there's the issue of Taiwan as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry, just before you do, the one thing I was told yesterday by a China expert was, one of the things that she is probably quite irritated by is China has always liked to think of itself as the most patient country in the world. whereas Putin is showing himself to be the most impatient country in the world. And that is a clash. That's a political, cultural clash. Sorry.
That's okay. Thanks. Tony Mallin speaking. I think you were suggesting that the sort of jobs for mates was a function of this particular government, but I seem to remember it was a similar feature with the Blair government, and it doesn't really matter what shade of politics. It seems to be a symptom of first past the post and the absolute power. And you sort of see this in America as well, with jobs for mates, where there's absolute power. Do you think a coalition structure would reduce the power base and reduce the likelihood of jobs for mates?
Well, I'm not sure about that because, again, if I go to Spain, I mean, in Spain it has been absolutely conventional that whenever you take over the local authority, you change the director of music at the chapel and at the concert hall, and you change the, everybody running the opera house and all the rest of it. I mean, that is absolutely standard in lots of other cultures. I don't think it was quite the same under Tony Blair. Indeed, Labour MPs were endlessly complaining about the fact that Tony wouldn't appoint enough people to posts. And the BBC was a case in point. So, in essence, your question was whether PR and something that more regularly led to coalition government would be better.
You take more power, or you take more absolute power away
from one person. Well, but you didn't under the coalition from.
Was it really a coalition?
Well, it was a coalition. It was definitely a coalition because the best part of 150 people were appointed to the House of Lords as Liberals. It's extraordinary. I mean, there isn't. I've yet to meet a member of the Liberal Party who isn't a member of the House of Lords.
Nick Clegg.
Which may say more about the people I hang out with than anything else. But so I don't buy that one, I'm afraid.
Well, Peter Mandelson was pretty close to Derek Prescott.
So I'm happy to. So the point that the gentleman was making was that Peter Mandelson was close to Derek Pasca, indeed. And I gather he's doing a radio programme next week, so it'll be interesting to see when he's questioned about it. And George Osborne was working for Deripaska, I think, last year. My perception about Russia and the UK is that when David Cameron came to power in 2010, he pretty much said this openly, and William Hague was the Foreign Secretary. They said, we want to do more business with Russia. It's crazy, the Labour government hasn't really understood how to deal with people, it's messed up the relationship, let's forget about Litvinenko, let's just do more business because it's a brick economy. Brazil, Russia, India, China. And I said at the time that I thought that that was problematic because the high levels of corruption in Russia meant it was very difficult to do more business with Russia, just per se. And Obama had tried to press the reset button with Putin and it hadn't worked. And Blair had invited Putin to London and given him a state visit. And that hadn't worked. So I was very sceptical about this. And I think that on the back of that Osborne and others, and Peter was probably part of this as well, just wanted to get more rich people, more inward investment into the UK, and fewer questions that were asked. And I think it meant that we were infiltrated. Yeah. And I've had charities ringing me up today saying, nobody can give us any advice. What do? We were given £250,000 by such and such oligarch who is now sanctioned. What do we do? And I said, well, the honest truth is I don't know, because you can't give it back. They're sanctioned individuals. That is a criminal offence. So you can't give it back. And they said, well, it feels like we have tainted money because we now know that Abramovich has been involved in, making sure that Russians can build tanks, which are now being used in Ukraine. Let alone, I don't know whether there are any Chelsea fans in there. Probably not, I should think. People who care passionately about their football club are very anguished about what's going to happen. But that money bastardised English football too, as did Usmanov's, as did whatever his name is in Newcastle. All this money that comes in, it just creates hyperinflation in football. We spend far too much money on football players that we buy in from everywhere else in the world, rather than train up local talent. So that's a very long answer about, which has nothing to do with what you asked about. But I am a politician.
That's a talent.
But at least I've admitted it.
Your local talent, anyway.
Oh, thanks very much indeed, Chris, for the talk. A question. With everything we talk about the situation in the UK Parliament, we seem to have some other examples that we can observe between the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament and so on. I'll leave the Northern Ireland out for a minute. If we look at the examples there, do you see the same kind of seeds of corruption there? For they're bringing the PR argument, they're bringing, you know, making substantive decisions, particularly the Scottish Parliament at the moment?
I'm not an expert at all on what's happening in Scotland. I know more about what's happening in the Senedd in Wales, obviously. I have colleagues in Wales in the Labour Party who object to the additional members. So in Wales, 40 members are elected to the Senedd for constituencies, the same constituencies as the parliamentary constituencies, and then 20 are add-ons according to a proportional system within each of the regions. And so, for instance, for a long time, when I was from when I was first elected in 2001, Leanne Wood for Plaid Cymru was a regional list member in the Senedd. And all my Labour colleagues were absolutely furious because they said, well, she doesn't have to do constituency casework, she doesn't have to, she's not accountable to anybody, she always gets re-elected because she's on the list, she doesn't have to even bother, you know, being accountable in any sense. And she doesn't properly represent a constituency. And I said, well, but on the other hand, she sort of keeps us honest a bit because there's a competition. Otherwise, you just have monopoly in my area. So I like that mix, I'm afraid. I mean, I don't particularly like Leanne, but but Leanne hates me. So and she's not a member of the Senedd anymore.
Question up there, and then here.
But actually, now I think about it, in Scotland, having power too long isn't necessarily very good for you, for anybody, I think. And you could say the same in Wales. It's not been my experience, but
the system in Scotland was purposely designed to
yes,
avoid getting majority.
I know. So we messed that up as well.
Can I just ask a specific question about Boris Johnson, which is the kind of elephant in the room, because he seriously isn't a good chap, and he's like the extreme version of the not good chap, and he seems to be pushing all the boundaries in terms of corruption and anti-democracy and all the details around what they're trying to do to suppress voters, etc. And I don't know if it's coming from him or Gove or Patel or whoever, but the one question I had for you is, qualitatively, do you get the feeling that his Tory colleagues mostly think it's fine, the way he's abusing his position, the way the corruption has abused the Tory party? And there's a long, long list of MPs who've taken everything from £3,000 through to £60,000, most of which, 99% are Tories. Is it regarded culturally as therefore normative and it's just going to carry on? Or do you get, because they keep wanting to get rid of him and then they keep coming back from the brink. I mean, do we have any chance of getting rid of him, or is he just going to carry on denigrating our culture and our politics while they let him have a free pass, really? Difficult question if you're not a Tory, but what do you think?
It's not Parliament, so you're wrong.
Well, oh, Lord. I mean, he's a terrible man. It's very odd being chair of the Committee on Standards because I'm not a very judgmental person, partly because I just think everybody, if you all started judging me, you know, I'd be off to hell in a minute. And so I'm not a very judgmental person, but I sometimes have to sit in judgment. That's part of what the role is. And I don't despise many people. But if I'm honest, I despise Boris Johnson because I think he is doing terrible things to our politics. Partygate sort of feels irrelevant now in one sense because of Ukraine and the foreign affairs. We were in Ukraine 4 weeks ago in the Far East and beyond Kramatorsk in Avdiivka village, and you know we went with 2 MPs who now carry submachine guns every day. So and we talk sometimes on the phone. So all of that, you know, parties and suitcases of wine and all that kind of stuff just feels kind of less relevant, but it isn't. It's just as relevant. Because if your leader is a liar, it's difficult to complain about Putin being a liar. If you've sort of traduced British decency and other countries just look at you as a joke, it's difficult to provide leadership. And if there's one phrase I would ban, it is world beating. It just drives me up the wall. Apart from anything else, it's not a competition. I mean, there is a race on sanctions, but the race is against time. It's not against anything else. And there's a little bit of a niggle at the back of my head which says, I mean, is he really, really, really bad? And that's why we're in this space, why it's taken so long to sanction. You know, the EU sanctioned 160 people 2 days ago. We sanctioned 7. We're way, way behind. And, you know, I gather Abramovich's yacht managed to escape because we gave him too long to, you know, it was in dock in Barcelona, being repaired. Sorry?
He minds, but do his colleagues mind?
Yeah, lots of Tories do,
Really?
and they are very, because, you know, so many of us have colleagues, have constituents who've been to us and said, look, I couldn't go to a funeral, I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. And in the end, the whole point about COVID was we were trying to say we're all in this together. Vaccination, it doesn't work unless we're all in this together. None of the strategies work unless we're all in this together. So the idea that some people might think that there's one set of rules for them and another for everybody else is just drives a coach and horses through the whole concept and is immoral and despicable. As it happens, I consider myself a socialist as well, not in the kind of Leninist tradition, but more in the sense of the kind of John Donne tradition that no man is an island entire unto himself, seek not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, any man's death diminishes me because I'm a part of humanity. And so, I mean, it just pains my heart when people tell me horrible stories about not being able to hold their dad's hand during COVID and Boris Johnson doing whatever he got up to. The thing that I think has unpicked the relationship between Boris Johnson and the Conservative MPs was Owen Paterson. Because they had to go through the lobbies to vote for a completely and utterly preposterous and immoral motion, which changed the rules for somebody who was patently corrupt at the very last minute because they were a friend. And lots of them feel terribly guilty about it. And I just went around all the time saying to everybody, read the report, read the report, read the report. And I don't suppose for an instant that either Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson read the report. That was me trying not to be partisan.
There was a hand up here. John Stock there. Yeah, that was the last hand I saw, and then there's one up there.
And incidentally, a Tory MP who once studied at Mansfield told me the other day that one of the problems is all the big beasts or the senior figures in the government at the moment are so blinded by ambition because they think the job might be available soon that they can't coordinate. And I think that that's one of the reasons behind us being so slow on sanctions legislation, being so slow on refugees, the whole thing, because people just won't work together.
You are a master of secrecy. I don't know who you're talking about.
He's a really nice man.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking. Just very quickly, I am from Great Bedouin, which you mentioned earlier.
Oh,
it's
right,
a seat
yes.
of corruption in the 16th century.
It doesn't get a seat of its own anymore.
No, but we do have one of Boris's mates was parachuted in to be our local MP, so maybe a plus ça change on that front. Yeah, but I just wanted to say thank you for the work you've done trying to push the government's hand on imposing sanctions on people. But I was amazed to read today that Sergei Lavrov's mistress's daughter has a house in Kensington, and obviously hasn't been seized yet. Are you able to exert more pressure on the government to impose more sanctions on Russians with assets in the UK?
Yes. So We had this rather bizarre session with Liz Truss at the Foreign Affairs Committee on Monday. I don't know whether anybody saw any of it, but she decided to have a right old go at me, and she blamed me, basically, for not introducing proper sanctions legislation in 2018, and said that I'd made a speech demanding amendments, and I hadn't made a speech at all. So it was just completely untrue. But
Inadvertently.
no. She apologised. Just bad research, I think. Yes, she blamed her staff. It's a common thing that people do. But the point I was going to make was that I think, weirdly, when we left the European Union, lots of government ministers said this will be wonderful because we'll be able to write our own sanctions regime. And unfortunately, we probably did make it too rather gold-plated and too complicated and cumbersome. But and we might have been better off remaining in the European Union. I hate to say this, but in relation to sanctions, because we've just been able to sanction all these people. And ironically enough, the economic crime bill which will go through the Lords, I think, on Monday evening, will now have a clause which says that if the EU have already done it, we can do it automatically. Which I think is just the biggest irony of the lot. Get Brexit done. Putin must fail. Yes, I think so. We are exerting more pressure. I've got quite a long list in my pocket, actually, of people that I still want to see sanctioned. I'm going to go and see Liz Truss on Monday, I hope, to lay out some of the reasons why. To try and understand. I don't understand why some of the people haven't been sanctioned earlier. There was nothing that was learnt this week about Abramovich which they didn't know in 2019. Not a single thing, other than the fact that Ukraine has been invaded. So they could have done Abramovich on day one. I don't understand why they didn't. And likewise, Deripaska and so on. It's very odd that Deripaska, incidentally, has not been sanctioned by the EU. And apparently he was on the list and then taken off the list very surreptitiously at the last minute. So we're trying to get to the bottom of that. But weirdly, the EU has sanctioned all the Duma members who voted in favour of the invasion, including the head of the, I've forgotten her name now, she's got a lot of pearls anyway. But she has a lot of properties in Italy. I gather she's got some in the UK. They're not £14 million properties. They're like £500,000 properties. And I suspect that some of those people will be more nervous about being sanctioned because it's their kind of nest egg. It's their just-in-case money, in case they have to flee Russia because they fall out with Putin, kind of thing. So we should be doing all those lists as fast as we possibly can. And Lavrov has always been nervous about falling out with Putin. I mean, his family life is his own matter, but a lot of it is in the UK.
There's at the back. Yes, that's right. Very back, yeah.
Another qualitative question, a bit of gossip behind the scenes, possibly. Trying to understand when there was some MPs who complained about pressure from the whips recently, I think around questions over leadership.
Yeah.
Were the whips actually being more unpleasant than they historically were? Or was it just a new generation of MPs saying this is not acceptable behaviour?
In my experience, the whips are very rarely nasty or rude. I've never had that, but I'm in the Labour Party and we're all very nice. There are certainly allegations of a variety of things. One, kind of out-and-out bullying, shouting, being threatened with deselection, all that kind of stuff. And it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that Boris did get rid of quite a lot of Conservatives in the last Parliament, just threw them out of the party, including, remember, Ken Clarke. So people are conscious that that is a power that he does have. And there isn't one of the difficulties of Boris is that the 2019 intake, some of whom are who are really great, actually, some of them are not, but they don't know each other because they've hardly physically been in the same building since they got elected in 2019. And Parliament is quite a sort of clubby thing. And so they've not had that. And I think that's made it rather more difficult for the government whips to exert influence on them. And I think that will change. But this whole business of all the different funds, which are now directly allocated by ministerial decision, is one of the things that means MPs are going, especially if you're in a marginal red wall seat, you go, well, I desperately want that £8 million for my new college or whatever, I'm not going to rebel. And I think that is corrupting. It's not obviously as bad as the 18th century, when basically at the end of the parliamentary session, the government chief whip, who was known as the patronage secretary, basically used to give out money at the door of Westminster Hall if your voting record was clean for the whole year. I don't think they do that. In fact, I know they don't do that.
Yeah, there's a hand here.
Hi there. You touched on earlier about you're not quite sure why certain people haven't been sanctioned earlier. Leila Moran here.
Could you just check if that's on? I think you might need to flick it up or hold it closer to you.
I think you just need
It's green?
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah.
So you touched on earlier about you're not quite sure why certain people haven't been sanctioned earlier. Leila Moran read out a lengthy list of names.
Yep.
You've got your own list of names in your top pocket here. But what really is the reason, do you think, that these people haven't been sanctioned? You've got your own opinion, of course, but what really is the reason? So I'll give you an example. Roman Abramovich is going to be at the top of everyone's list. He's the highest profile oligarch in this country, or has been. And he's made several donations to a lot of charities and what have you. A lot of these have been lobbying on his behalf. Has that had any impact or influence on our politics here and decisions to really drag our heels to get this guy sanctioned? What's the real reason of this guy? I mean, he's the highest profile, so he has to be. It's the elephant in the room. And lastly, will there be an inquiry or any kind of investigation into this? Because this will highlight what's really wrong with all this.
Well, it's been quite interesting because the thing I care most about at the moment is what's happening to the people in Ukraine. And so on occasion, I've wanted to show no gap, political gap between me and the Conservative Party. I want us all to be 100% united. But at the same time, I'm completely mystified about why it's taken so long to sanction people. So, for instance, Liz Truss told the committee on Monday that the government had intelligence in October of last year that Putin was thinking of an invasion of Ukraine. And certainly by November, they thought it was a plan, which he might not execute, but a strongly possible plan. I would have thought that since they'd known since 2019, because of a court case where they lost on a sanction, that they had a problem with the sanction legislation, I would have thought that they would have sat down that very day and gone, right, we've got to get our sanction ducks in a row. But apparently they didn't start doing that until the invasion had actually started. I can't explain that. I mean, it may just be it might be laziness, it might be incompetence, or it might be the Treasury saying, do we really want to sanction all these people because they bring so much money into the UK and that, you know, they give money to charity and the football clubs and I support Chelsea and I don't know. Or I support Everton because Osmanov is Everton. I really don't know. I can't get to the bottom of that. And it also applies, incidentally, to the issue of welcoming refugees from Ukraine into the UK. Surely, the moment they thought that Putin might be going to do this, they would have gone, right, there's going to be 4 to 7 million refugees. What are we going to do to make sure that they can come to the UK and that there's somewhere for them to live and that we can offer them a proper welcome? You would have thought that they would have done that. And they wouldn't be messing around 3 weeks in with whether or not there's going to be a place in Lille or Arras or somewhere in Poland or whatever. I mean, you would have thought. So again, in that situation, is that heartlessness? Is it ideology about foreigners and refugees? Or is it just incompetence and laziness? It's difficult to tell. Or is it that all these departments can't work together? Because I felt exactly the same about Afghanistan last year, when we were all desperate to get people to safety, and it didn't feel as if the 3 departments who were in charge, Defence, Home Affairs and Foreign Affairs, we're singing or working together in any shape or form. And then there's a tiny bit of me that thinks that some people around in government have been frightened that people would say Brexit basically was doing Putin's job, and a lot of the people that we've associated with are really rather close to that kind of ideology. Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, etc. We really don't want to play around with this.
But it's not something rotten in our state and corruption and what have you. Because I haven't heard, throughout all this, I don't think I've heard much of that in this. And this is the worrying thing about it, because people get away with it, right? Because we expect the opposition to actually then push through some kind of investigation or something like this and ask the obvious question. I haven't heard that. I've heard a lot of something else, but not actually the actual corruption bit. That's why we're here.
But that then takes you back to the other thing, which is the only people who can, launch a judge-led inquiry are the government. That's why I think all of this goes back to the fact that we in the UK have such a high theology of government. And I've said this repeatedly to Jacob Rees-Mogg. His basic view is, as long as the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister can do what the Prime Minister wants. And I think that is, if it's not necessarily corrupt, it is corrupting, because it's the abrogation of power.
I'm going to leave it there, because I think you've answered a lot of questions and I can see lots of hands that we go on, but that was an amazing talk. Thank you very much. Obviously not a big beast, a very svelte beast, looking fine in a waistcoat, but a very impressive talk, and we're very proud to have you as an honour of member of Mansfield, and thank you very much for an amazing talk.